Good day to you. It is Monday, May 19th, 2025, here in Chico, California, and this is Anagalactic, bringing you the secrets of the universe. Today, I'd like to be a bit informal and go through basically what you see over here. Now, we're not going to go through the moon, although Jules Verne did write a story about going into the moon. People have always been interested in the sky, the objects in the sky, the first of which is, of course, the moon. We call it the moon because it's ours. We only have one. The inner planets, Venus and Mercury, do not have moons. Mars does not have moons, but it does have two captured Trojans, which serve as moons, although they're not spherical. They're spheroid. You would expect so. They're rather large. Deimos and Phobos. Men have also feared what they found in the sky. Deimos means terror, and Phobos means, of course, morbid fear. So those are the two wonderful names of the rather ugly little planetoids of Mars. And then there's a gap, which is occupied by the asteroid belt, which has also arrested the interest of scientists as they progressively discovered the asteroid belt, which is between Mars and Jupiter. No one is quite sure why those asteroids are there, but it is quite provocative because the first thing one notices once one gets the distances to the planets is that the asteroid belt occupies a ring which might have at one time been a planet that perhaps exploded or otherwise was destroyed. But nobody is quite sure about that. And then Jupiter is the largest planet. It's beyond the frost line, and the frost line is a very interesting concept. It's arbitrary, of course, but there is a spectrum of heat where it's definitely warmer towards the center and it's much colder out towards the periphery. And so this term frost line basically divides what are called the terrestrial planets, of which there are 4, from the giant planets, of which there are 4. Jupiter and Saturn are given the name giants, along with Uranus and Neptune. But a subclass has been invented. This is just a classificational system, that all 4 are considered to be giants, and sometimes all 4 are called gas giants. But there is a further subdivision, if one accepts such a classification. The Jupiter and Saturn are properly gas giants, but after Saturn, they're frozen, and they're called ice giants. Now, of course, an atmosphere of that magnitude will have several temperature ranges. But it is reasonable to say, of course, that Uranus and Neptune are much colder than Saturn and Jupiter. There is another body, as you're well aware by now, if you've studied astronomy to any depth, that there had been a named planet that would have been the 9th planet, and for decades it was called a planet, and all the children learned the 9 planets, the last of which is called Pluto. At that time, when I found out that Pluto had been demoted, essentially, removed from the list of planets because a better classificational system was devised by a consortium of astronomers and astrophysicists who put out a decree, essentially, which is their job, one would want to put it nicely. Who makes these decisions? Well, somebody has to make these decisions, one supposes. So Pluto is no longer properly a planet. It was in the early part of this millennium, in the early 2000s, that this decision was made. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, of whom I had never heard, wrote a very, very good book. I read it. It was given to me by my brother. A book of short articles on astronomy by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is a good writer, I would say. I think he did a good job. I knew nothing of the man at all. And I'm not even sure that Neil deGrasse Tyson was out on the internet or at YouTube or anywhere, but he was well known, and he made a good name for himself as a writer of popular science. Accurate, he's a very astute astrophysicist. And one of the short stories, or articles I should say, was about the changing of the status of Pluto to a dwarf planet. And this raised, apparently, quite a stir, because this would change a lot of textbooks, etc., etc. Not quite on the order of the Tau aficionados about the same time, who made a very good case as a consortium of mathematicians that pi was not really the most useful irrational constant for the relationship between linearity and circularity, which, as you know, is 6.28. It is not pi. It is 2 pi. And that's been known for a very long time. And it was Leonhard Euler, whom still to this day many educated Americans on the East Coast really get something up their butt about pronouncing it Euler, probably because they had some trauma having to do with Germans and their language. And I've heard men say quite pointedly, leaning in toward the camera, Euler, and they look for an extra second or two. Euler, like they're correcting the German pronunciation of the man's name. Euler, like out here you'll say it our way. I'll be catching you saying Euler, you kraut. So I got this book by Neil deGrasse Tyson, whom today I have come to know as, I'll just say politely, a multi-sided character. But I knew nothing of the man or his personality. I really could barely concentrate on his face. I didn't know him. He's a distinguished looking man. I wouldn't say there's anything overtly wrong with Neil deGrasse Tyson. And so I read this book that my brother gave me, pretty much as the Pluto controversy was dying down. Some people are mostly educators. Because, of course, this does change the curriculum somewhat. And you're teaching the kids about the planets, and, you know, their older brothers and sisters know that there's 9 planets, but now these youngsters are being taught, no, it's been changed. There are only 8. Well, 8 is a very natural number for memorization, especially when you realize that there are 4 terrestrial planets and 4 giants, sometimes called gas giants. That's why I covered that. And so it's rather easy to do a binary count of the 8 planets, which is 2 to the 3rd power, which means it divides into 2 to the 2nd and 2 to the 1st. So you have 4, possibly 4 groups of 2, and it turns out that works out marvelously. Venus is a vomitaceous planet, one of the most hideous planets conceivable. Basically sulfuric acid and just at the temperature of molten lead. It's hotter than that. Although the Russians landed on the surface, and that blasted vehicle lasted a few seconds before, of course, it was vaporized. But it landed on this surface long enough to say that it landed, and took a picture, and then poof, it's gone. Mercury is somewhat miraculous, in my opinion. Again, frightening. This little tiny, very spherical, tiny planet just goes, basically just rides the waves of the coronasphere, just being burned, just right next to the sun, and yet it's still there. Venus is much hotter. Well, not much hotter, but it's much different. It has an atmosphere, but it's not what we would call a congenial atmosphere. It is very, very hot and nasty. It's acid. And that's the 2nd planet. And those two kind of go together. They're both very hot. And then there are 2 planets, Earth and Mars. And Mars was the subject of quite a bit of speculation for quite a long time as telescopes were being developed through the centuries to the present day. The surface of Mars became progressively more resolved in our minds and imaginations, and it sure looked like there were canals. It turns out that those canals are somewhat misleading, but that planet is still quite a mystery. It looks, to me, I will join what other men have noticed about the planet Mars, is that it's almost impossible not to imagine that it was inhabited at one time. It would be at the right range. It's inside the frost line. Although Mars is extremely cold. You've seen dry ice. Well, basically, it's a dry ice locker. It's just extremely cold. But not just because it's further away from the sun, which is, of course, the main influence in terms of heat, the heat that the planet can gather. What makes Mars so desolate is not just its distance from the sun, but the fact that it has no proper atmosphere. It does have an atmosphere. As you know, we have rovers and actually even drones tooling around and doing wheelies and then flitting. There's these drones that can fly in the atmosphere, but it's thin and it doesn't have oxygen. It just doesn't have it. It's carbon dioxide mostly. And what we've discovered about Mars is there was never any life there. But you can't say that absolutely. And of course, I would have to put it this way. We want to find life on Mars. We're looking avidly. You have to ask yourself, why in the world would the United States government want to land on Mars? Well, I don't recommend looking into that, because unless you're just willing to lie to yourself. So I'm not going to go into that, because this is more of a jolly time for us. We want to have fun. We're not too interested in what the governments are doing. But it is necessary to realize that it is a government that is in outer space, not humans. Now you could say, whoa, Scott, well, you certainly haven't kept up. A man stood on the moon, Scott. And I have to sit there and listen, because I do make exaggerated statements. And I do it quite knowingly. For whatever psychological reasons, probably some desire or need to get attention. Why would I do that? Well, why does anybody do that? Because we're communal, communicative beings. But as for a bunch of people just getting together and saying, we could fly to Mars if we really put our minds to it. Let's get the guys together. This will take at least 3 or 4 generations. We'll have to train them. We'll have to create a whole cast of mathematicians. And we're going to have to start building out our cities to get steel and liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, and put them all together and try not to let it explode. The way that SpaceX, for instance, really just inheriting the technology that is always advancing, is still using essentially solid fuel. Now, you could say it's really not solid, it's liquid. Well, the point being, it's not a turbojet. There's no air in outer space, so you can't have jets. Well, how are you going to power off the Earth's surface and then navigate through the solar system? Rocketry, which is extremely inefficient. It's just, we're still basically in the Stone Age. And it's just mesmerizing, certainly it was to me as a child, to see these vehicles, these rockets, literally shooting fire out of their tails and ascending at an increasing velocity, escaping the Earth's orbit, not blowing up, although, there's some sordid stories. We lost quite a few. I believe it's called the Challenger. And an O-ring failed, and the whole thing exploded not very far off of the surface of the Earth and killed all the crew members, of which there were actually quite a few. And they all screamed out their last cry as they were burned alive in the air. So it's not all fun and games when you encounter a glitch like that. The Russians, who are of course trying to beat us into outer space, it was said, true enough, they lost more than one cosmonaut because they couldn't return the cosmonaut to the surface of the Earth to preserve his life. And so they would monitor his heartbeat as he just slowly died in orbit. And it's quite likely, although I haven't checked, that those corpses are still circling the Earth. So again, it's not all fun and games. There's a price to pay. There's a huge price for outer space exploration. It comes out of your pocket. I'm sure that you're aware of that vaguely. But the fact that the United States government, along with the Russian government, which those two governments are very closely related. You might say, oh my God, no, Scott, you don't know anything about politics. Yeah, I know because I exaggerate a lot. I give that impression, but actually, I know so much more than you do. This is usually the kind of encounter I have with other rational thinking, curious men. Is that I'm smarter than they are. And I know so much more than they do that they don't enjoy the conversation at all. And that just irritates the fuck out of me. So we're not going to go there either. What I'm talking about here in this brief presentation is our personal, individual, human encounter with the universe, which begins with this object. Every child, every human, without any exceptions, begin with this object. We see it at a very early age, and then we see it again and again and again. And every time we look at it, it's different. It's in a different phase. It's in a different temporal position in the sky. And sometimes it'll appear during the day, and you can see it. Even in full sunlight, you'll still see it. Not quite full sunlight. It has to be near dawn or dusk. But with the sun fully in the sky, you can also see the moon sometimes. And then for about 3 days, you can't find the moon at all. It simply disappears. And that's not quite true, as you're well aware. And if you know where to look, and certainly if you have astronomical equipment like binoculars or a telescope, you can find the new moon in the sky. But not always. All of these cycles are circular. The moon itself is circular. It's composed of 2 orthogonal circles because of its relationship with the sun. It also only shows one side to the Earth, although there's a slight wobble, as you could probably imagine. So the moon teaches us about sphericity before we get into school. And the first class that every human being engages, per force, because this is nature, not humans. Not the previous generation shoving propaganda and useful information down the child's throat, or really into his brain. No, you're taught directly from the universe, and this is the very first lesson. Nothing comes before this. You may object. You can sense that I'm exaggerating again. Because what about the child's encounter, for instance, with the sun? Doesn't that come first? No. What about the child's encounter with the plants and the animals, the insects, the birds, fish, weather, all kinds of more localized natural phenomena? Don't we learn that first? No. And here's why I say it that way. It's because you need to be more specific, and I am smart enough to be that specific, that you encounter nature in 2 entirely different ways. This is very rarely stated as such, but this is the way I think. And my thought patterns are higher than most men's. I think at a much, much higher level, because I'm looking for meaning. And most men are not. They get that drilled out of them right away. It's like I heard said in a class in poetry that I took, an elective at a junior college, and I was so interested in poetry that I signed up for that class to learn more about poetry. And the teacher, who himself was a poet, Morton Marcuse or something like that, but he was a published poet and actually quite well known, so I was fortunate to have this man as a teacher. And we all liked him. He was quite provocative. So he wasn't always, you know, because as a poet, he was seeing two sides of life, and he wanted us to experience it all, so we would become better poets. So he would say some provocative things that not everybody liked. I just thought he was a good teacher, and that was his style. He was okay. Nobody like hated him. We actually really liked him, but he was provocative at times. And one of the things he said stayed with me, and I knew it was one of those moments when you hear a bit of wisdom or insight, and you just know that you're never going to forget what you just heard. And I never have, so I'll share it with you. He said, most people who get into poetry and are attracted into it, such that they want to write it, they want to be poets. That he said that they have it processed out of them. I believe he said beaten out of them. Or oppressive. There's something oppressive that just forces them to change their mind. That they just lose it. They had it, and they were pursuing that dream of being a good poet, a better poet, progressively, and then they just gave up and never went back. And he said that is the most common story. And I thought that is true of so many aspects of life, that we're attracted in different directions, but we don't stay with it. And I've always been curious about what becomes attractive to a man in nature, that he keeps going and doesn't stop. And that's why I say that whatever a child learns about the earth and its system, its ecosystem, which is a good term to use if you're trying to embrace all the processes and dynamisms, balances, and the millions of species which are everywhere, in the water, in the air, in the trees, in the earth itself, every size imaginable within the range proper to our gravitational potential on Earth. The animals have to be within a certain range of size, but you have elephants, you have whales. There used to be very large creatures, which are collectively today called dinosaurs, but that, of course, is just a convenience term. I'm talking about more than just lizards. There were giant everything. And the reason was determined, believe it or not. The reason for the large size of animals, not that long ago, I won't say millions of years ago, but that is what is in the textbooks, is that it was millions of years ago that these very large creatures walked the earth and flew and swam. Basically dinosaurs, a race of lizards, a race of lizards. They're classified as lizards. And they dominated the earth for a very long time. Oh, you'd have to say long enough to... They were quite extensive, and nobody is quite sure how extensive were the dinosaurs, or even how many. Because, of course, they're all gone now. There are no descendants of the dinosaurs. There are lizards, though. And there's even a Komodo dragon, the largest of the lizards, I believe, unless you include alligators, and those things were huge too. So everything was much larger at that time, and the reason was determined. Almost certainly correct, but there was quite a bit of political activity at the time of this discovery. It was made in Texas and announced from Texas using a berry chamber. And this berry chamber, which is known to have homeopathic medicinal value for the human body. What it means is you get into a chamber where the air pressure is increased. And you might think, well, that could be dangerous. Yes, it could be. But it's been determined that the human body, and in fact animal bodies were also tested. Yeah, there were humans who, because you can control it enough, it's not like all of a sudden the person just turns some other color and dies. But what does actually happen when you increase the air pressure, called hyperbaric pressure, it doesn't hurt the person within a certain range. Of course, if you increased it dramatically, it would kill the person, actually. First, it would knock you out. But you would experience discomfort. But within a certain range, and I won't say exactly the range, you could look this up, it not only has no deleterious effect on a human or an animal, but it helps them. Bones set faster in a hyperbaric chamber. And I've been in more than one hospital where on one floor was a hyperbarium. And people would go into the hyperbaric chamber for therapy. So it's well-respected discovery that hyperbaric pressure has a value to life. And from this it was extrapolated, and a formal paper, I'm not sure how many papers, but this was a well-publicized discovery of one of the most amazing things I think I've ever seen of this type. It showed a very long, like, we're talking about stretching it out on a football field, it would be tens of yards long. I don't remember exactly how long, but it was long enough, this chamber, shaped like a tube, and of course sealed very tightly so that the air pressure could be increased, but not let it escape. So that's rather obvious. But inside this hyperbarium were placed plants and animals to see how they would do. And one of the ideas was to put in a flying squirrel, and there are such things. Now, they don't fly in the sense of flapping their wings, but what they do is they glide, and they know how to control themselves. They can, and once they jump from a high part of a tree, they can glide. As you've seen hang gliders do this, they stretch out a tissue membrane between their legs, and by George, they look like a hang glider, all right. Two big planes of skin that's stretched, and they soar like a bird. They don't flap. They won't do this. They're not trying to gain altitude. They're trying to control their flight horizontally, and they can go a long ways. What was discovered in the hyperbaric chamber is that flying squirrels can fly much farther in hyperbaric pressure. And it was surmised, I think brilliantly surmised, that the reason for the large size of the creatures, especially the dinosaurs, the land-based dinosaurs, including gigantic pterodactyls and other flying lizards. They're scary-looking things. These were meat-eating creatures. At least those were. And some of them were vegetable-eating, and those were preyed upon by the meat-eating lizards. So it was quite an aspect of the ecology that these lizards lived here, extensive all over the earth, these giant lizards. But the reason they were so large is because the Earth's atmosphere at the time was hyperbaric with respect to the present forget the scientific word, but was air pressure. It's the weight of the air on us at the surface or near the surface. But the Earth used to be the Earth used to have a denser atmosphere. And that would explain the size of the creatures. And there is no other explanation, so it is a match. But you never hear about that anymore. And you didn't hear about it much at the time. And the simple reason why that fact is unknown today, even though it's on the record, why it's not taught, why it's not promoted, is because it contradicts an already established model. And you might think, well, my God, science is supposed to adjust to new information. Yes, it is. Certainly, of course it is. That is what science is. It's adjusting to new information so that you understand what's going on in your environment. Well, the problem with this discovery is that it contradicted a model of how the creatures on Earth developed. And it's just sad to say this is just one of a list of major discoveries right here on Earth about the ecology that were made in the 60s and 70s and beyond, into the 80s, during which time the theory of natural selection had become approved by the United States government, with a certain form of strange psychic collaboration is the best way I could phrase it. It was just an amazing takeover that in the public school system in America, there was really no way to teach the children where the ecology came from in any sense, because nobody knew. There was no theory of the origin of species or the ecology. None. But archaeology had uncovered these dinosaurs, and there's all kinds of activity because there are many, many more people, and technology had increased so much that it was necessary from some point of view, really a political, national, governmental point of view, that the upcoming generation is beginning at the present in the 60s. How do we want to train these children so that they can serve the government? Because we need to get into outer space, and we are going to need these children, and we need to train them to fight the Russians. That's exactly was the premise. The Russians are going to kill us all. The Russians are going to murder us unless we can murder them back and murder them harder. So we need the children to know that. We need them as soldiers, but really we need them as engineers. We need mathematicians. We need mathematicians. And so they were bred. And they were bred with propaganda. And this was a major, major tearing of the American society. Because until the 1960s, almost exactly, the origin of species or the origin of anything was left to the churches. It was left to the home. It was left to the community. Your religion would tell you that. Science had nothing to offer. But then the game changed, and the Russians had Sputnik. In the late 1950s, they were in outer space ahead of the United States. Well, you know that just could not persist, because then the Russians would kill us all. The bloodthirsty communists. It was a definite threat. It was real. It was not contrived. The communists at that time were well on their way to becoming a superpower. And if the United States did nothing, then eventually there would be no United States, because the Russians would have taken over Europe. And then they would have gotten us. And if we didn't keep up, they would simply invade, perhaps bombing us first. And there would be no more United States. There would only be the goddamn communist Russians. And that was unthinkable to, you might say, the descendants of the founding fathers, whatever group that is, the Congress and Senate and whatever makes a government, it's quite complicated in the United States, and it's a good system. I mean, good enough. Better than any other because of the checks and balances, which of course don't function perfectly, but it's better here than anywhere else. There's no question about that. The United States is the only place worth living in, probably in all of history. So there was something to save. However, in order to raise the children so that they would be good Americans, engineers and mathematicians and soldiers, fighter pilots were very much needed. All kinds of trained personnel to guide missile systems. To build all this shit would take hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, all working concertedly to get into outer space. We had to. And you know the story, I'm sure you do if you're not too young, that there was a race called the space race. And eventually it was conceded that the United States won. In the meantime, the hydrogen bomb had been developed by the former Nazi scientists, both in Russia and in the United States. And so the thermonuclear age had arrived, and then the Russians, that is the communists, set off the largest explosion in human history. You would like to know, first of all, about your environment, and eventually about the heavens. That's the natural order of events, because you're not born in the heavens. You're born on Earth. You're not born on the moon or Mars or anywhere else. You're born on Earth, which has its own gravitational center. So it does look like it's the center of the universe. There's no way around that perception. We've since found out it's a little more complicated than that. But at one time, the Earth had a hyperbaric atmosphere, and the creatures were much larger. And just to complete the dovetailing story of what happened in the United States classrooms in the 1960s, is even though it was discovered that the Earth had a hyperbaric atmosphere at one time, the people who got hold of that information and broadcast it the loudest were the Christian creationists. And they still exist. They're still organizations. You just don't hear from them any longer because they're absolutely discredited, quite artificially, because there was a war that was fought. It just tore this country in half, and the country will never heal. The United States was just lethally wounded by an assault of deception artists who you would have to say at some level meant well, because they were trying to preserve, let's be honest, they were trying to preserve their own fucking asses. They were trying to defend themselves, their government, their vision, their ideas. It was by no means all Americans. No government represents its own people. The government is there to rape the people. That's all a government has ever done in the whole history of mankind. A government is there to rob you and to take your children and murder them. But it's all about money. A government is a money machine. And those who defend it before the civil populace, such as John F. Kennedy, try to get everyone to see just how wonderful is America. And every president tries to do that until the most recent president. And it's all, of course, it's militaristic. It's military. You're trying to defeat all the other countries on Earth. And in democracy, you just pretend that you're trying to help them. You're not trying to help them. You're trying to conquer them so they don't conquer you first. It's dog eat dog. So in the classrooms, some really terrifying changes were made. And it was hailed as the greatest breakthrough in educational history that natural selection has been proved. And therefore the creationists are assholes. And the creationists fought back, and I lived through this. I actually participated in it. Because the lies that were told by the natural selection cartel were just abysmal. But then what's much worse, the information was suppressed so the children wouldn't know the facts. And one of those facts was the hyperbaric atmosphere of Earth. And it wasn't millions of years ago. That was being discovered progressively and would finally be shown to be true. That the animals, such as the dinosaurs that are now extinct, did not live as long ago as has been stated and proved. That those dinosaurs lived on the order of 300 million years ago. That's in Wikipedia. To this day. Well, that's balderdash. Absolutely impossible that that's true. And we know that now, and you should know that, but you never will. And you probably think that I'm wrong. Well, that's the way it goes. You're not allowed to know what I just told you. And there's a whole list of other discoveries that were made about our ecology and its history. How this ecology got here. Well, you have no choice on what you're allowed to say about that now. There's no such thing anymore as creationism. Scientifically often called catastrophism. Well, you may have heard a story from the endlessly packed cellar of superstition that humans have just invented. The stupidest ideas imaginable, such as there must be a supreme designer that designed this and therefore engineered the whole thing in a short amount of time. However that happened, it's the only thing that could have happened. Is this Earth, along with the solar system, was engineered in an extremely short period of time. Fully outlined in the Bible. Absolutely laid out as plain as day in the opening chapter of Holy Scripture. You would be out of your mind now to even suggest that there's a grain of truth in that story. And yet the hyperbaric atmosphere would have existed before a cataclysmic event changed the air pressure of Earth. And what could have done that? In the 1980s, it was discovered what did that. Okay? You'll never hear this from any other man. There's no way that you can believe me. But I'm going to tell you the truth, the proven truth of how this ecology got here. We now know that the Earth was struck by a comet. And Wikipedia, very grudgingly, was forced to create an article about this major discovery, which was so violently suppressed that I believe that Walter Alvarez may have been in danger of being assassinated, because his discovery changes the textbooks fully vindicating the creation sciences, fully vindicating the Bible story. There was a flood. Now, in the Wikipedia article, you will find that information. You can find it. It's in Wikipedia. That the Earth was struck by a comet. And this was so violently suppressed that it took 3 decades before anyone would even listen to Walter Alvarez, to the degree of letting any young people know about it. Because creationism is the enemy of the United States government. There's no God, there's no creation, there's no Bible, there's no Jesus. That is the American government, period. It's determined to eliminate that idea from the human race. And it showed. I can testify that's exactly what happened, and it was successful, 100% successful. You will never know the truth about your origins, ever. It's not allowed. Much more harsh than Hitler's Germany. Much more harsh than Stalin's communist Russia and Eastern Europe. That you're not allowed to know the truth that you have to know to complete yourself as a human. You're not allowed to be a human. You're not allowed to grow. And you're certainly not allowed to get out of this trap, which is what you see around you. You like what Israel is doing? You like the advances made in China? You know what India is turning into? What's happening to Iran? I could go all over the globe. It's worse than ever. There has been no progress in civilization at all. And humans are not in outer space. The rapacious government is over your heads now. And it's not going to stop. Every weapon that's ever been created by mankind has been used. And there's no reason to expect any deviation from that eventuality. And now that things are heating up in the Middle East again, the United States is just about to invade Iran. It'll be this year or next year. And United States troops will be in Iran. Or there won't be any Iran. It'll be bombed. Harshly. At the instigation of Israel, of course. Why do you think there are lobbyists in Washington, D.C. for Israel? It's to make sure Israel wins. Okay. What does that have to do with a hyperbaric atmosphere? It's simply this. Now that we know from Walter Alvarez, who is the son of a PhD physicist who got a Nobel Prize. Louis Alvarez got a Nobel Prize in physics. His son discovered the Chicxulub impactor. And his son has received the highest awards in his field of geology. Undoubtedly one of the greatest geologists, probably the greatest geologist of all time. Far surpassing Muir, Lyell, anybody in the 19th century. They were primitive compared to the work, the brilliant work done by Walter Alvarez and his small team. Both in Italy and in other places around the world, he discovered that the Earth was struck by a comet. And he was either unwilling, I wish I could talk with him, he's still alive by the way, and ask him, were you ever tempted to date how long ago that comet struck the Earth? Because it's critical to know how long ago that was. In Wikipedia, it gives the compromised bottom line, that the American government had to respond to this very quickly, or it could have gone wildfire. that actually it's proof against natural selection. There is no such thing. I hope you realize that's been disproved. So there is no such thing as Darwinianism. The species did not change into each other. Well, then what wiped out the dinosaurs? What wiped out the dinosaurs? You probably think that you know. There is zero chance that you do know. I know what happened to the dinosaurs because it's been scientifically proved what happened to the dinosaurs. And I'm one of the foremost experts on this subject of all time. I know everything about that issue, of how the ecology got here. Do you know how long men have known about this present-day ecology? 6,000 years maximum. Before that, there was no human civilization. It only goes back 6,000 years, and then abruptly disappears. Despite the propaganda that you've heard, there is no evidence of people, humans, being on the earth longer than 10,000 years ago. No evidence of that. The dating methods for the shit-ass skulls that were dug up in Africa and Ethiopia, bullshit. Those are not millions of years old. That's insane. So, what happened to the dinosaurs? Well, Wikipedia has finally conceded, and it has a whole article on Chicxulub. Chixulub. If you look that up, you'll read the article where it talks about, I'm not making this up, mega tsunamis that scoured the earth. A flood. A worldwide flood. How long ago was that? Do you have any idea? Do you know what the evidence is for how long ago was that flood? That, by the way, destroyed the hyperbaric atmosphere system and reduced the air pressure so there could not be huge animals anymore. The biggest land animal is the elephant. And there is no animal that can possibly be bigger than that because of the air pressure. But about 10,000 years ago, it was hyperbaric, and all the animals were much larger than they are now. Much larger. Were there humans? Yes, there were. And it is known from historical records that have been preserved miraculously that there were giant humans. Giants. It's only recorded by one source. The record of giants. There are legends that persisted in Greece about these giants, including the Cyclops. But without going into that aspect of the situation, what was discovered in the 1980s, and absolutely confirmed by this millennium, is that the Earth was struck by a comet that buried the dinosaurs. They were buried under sedimentary layers. That's why there are trillions of barrels of oil locked under the surface of the Earth in the crust. All of those oil fields are due to sedimentary rock being laid on top of the dinosaurs. Those are dinosaurs. All the petroleum is from dinosaurs. How did trillions of tons of this carbon goop, also the coal fields, were laid down by extremely violent activity? Well, who's ever going to tell you that? To this day, it is stated that what killed the dinosaurs were volcanoes, basically from the Deccan Traps of India. That's been totally disproved. That does not change the textbooks. So the level of propaganda is... there's no words to describe this level of propagandization. So to complete the actual story of how the actual ecology actually got here on the actual Earth, using actual evidence and actual proof sequences that are undeniable, that comet struck the Earth no further ago than 20,000 years ago. Destroying whatever had been the original ecology, including a hydraulic system of hot water chambers that ranged all around the Earth to keep it pleasant, and a very much more high pressure atmosphere to make things healthy and comfortable for all creatures. That was destroyed by a comet strike 20,000 years ago maximum. Wikipedia just toes the propagandistic line. I don't think they have any choice. And they say it was 330 million years ago. That's absurd. And I'm not even going to tell you the reasons why that's absurd, because you won't listen. You can't. You cannot believe what I'm saying. It's too dangerous to you. But I'm telling you anyway, so that you'll know that at least one man, I may be the only one, I may be the last, willing to state all of this information forthrightly. But you have certainly been systematically lied to about this ecology. And if you had a brain in your head that worked, you would be able, within a very short period of concentrated study, convince yourself absolutely there's no such thing as evolution. It's never been seen. There's no evidence of it at all. It's just a pipe dream of an Englishman. He wasn't the only one who had that idea, by the way. The golly, gee, it sure looks like the animals changed into each other. And it just got more and more complex by some magic act. Well, you're stark staring mad. It's absolutely unthinkable. That simply did not happen. It's not true. But oh my God, Neil deGrasse Tyson would argue with me, any scientist would argue with me, and they would want to kill me. It makes people angry. Men like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who are thoroughly brainwashed, get very upset when they hear someone like me tell the truth. Doesn't make them look good. So there's no question that the Earth was hit by a comet 20,000 years ago. Could have been less. And whatever was here before that, whether it was 10,000 years ago, which is far more likely, or 20,000 years, not much more than that. It's impossible to extend that amount of time backwards without losing all the fossils, because we know that the tectonic plates move. And anything that's buried under the earth, first of all, how the fuck did anything get buried underground? To make the oil fields? That could only have been a comet strike, is the only way that could have happened. But how long ago? It has to be less than 20,000 years ago. Otherwise, there would be no evidence that it happened at all. In another 100,000 years, there won't be any evidence left because it all will be gone. Everything moves. Well, certainly in 1,000,000 years. But you see, we're talking about 330 million years. That's insane. The Earth hasn't even been here that long. You hear it said that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. No, it's not. You have to tell the whole truth. If you just stop and say that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, you're a liar. Because you're not telling the whole truth that the person certainly wants to hear. If you're not lying in your teeth. So how long has the Earth been here? 50,000 years at the most. The rings of Saturn prove it. The amount of dust on the moon proves it. There are countless proofs of a very recent solar system. Not millions of years, not billions of years, nothing like that. The level of brainwashing is unbelievable. Where did those goddamn dinosaurs come from? Why are there none left? Why are there oil fields? Why is it all sedimentary rock, which has to be laid down by billions of tons of water? It's the only way to pressurize oil. So there was a flood. God damn it! There was a flood! It's in Wikipedia! How do you not know that? So your scientists are unworthy of their names. They're not reputable men. They're not helping your studies. So, to get back to the moon, it is interesting that that object makes a perfect circle. A perfect circle. And there are two perfect circles on the moon at all times because of the rays of the sun striking it. That makes another perfect circle, and it's perpendicular to another circle, and that defines universal geometry. Two circles that geometrically and mathematically lock to a sphere. And so a sphere is made of two orthogonal circles. That's where the human race got the idea of a right angle. A right angle. We learned it from the universe. What is the difference, though, between the way we're taught a right angle and the way the universe teaches the right angle? They're both right angles. That's called orthogonality. It's the opposite of parallelity. You won't find anything parallel in the whole universe, but you find orthogonality everywhere. Everything is orthogonal, but what's the difference between Euclidean orthogonality and physical? It's that to make the hard right angle that you and I were forced to learn in school is two lines can be drawn on a plane to make a hard right angle. A hard right angle. That is impossible. But what is not impossible are two right angle circles. And where those two circles meet, if you home in on it, as you'll see the calculus engineers doing, to show you how to do calculus on a curved surface, they home into what they call local space, and it's a hard right angle. where two circles intersect is a hard right angle. They're lying. Of course it's not a hard right angle, but they make it look like it is. So your mathematicians are liars. Euclid was a liar. Einstein was a liar. None of these men tell the truth at all. They'll teach you about the Pythagorean theorem and go to bed happy knowing they helped the human race. The Pythagorean theorem is one of the most destructive theorems ever invented by the poisoned mind of man, for one reason and only one reason, is that nobody will ever tell you the whole truth. They'll stop with that goddamn right angle and start teaching you sine and cosine, as if that were the most natural thing to do. What they all leave out, every PhD mathematician, every mathematician from the beginning of time has left out the most critical fact about orthogonality. When you find it in nature, such as on the moon, where the two circles intersect and you home in and it looks just like a hard right angle. You know, the only place where that hard right angle actually occurs is in imaginary space. I discovered that. This is Anagalactic, bringing you the secrets of the universe, the geometry of the moon that overturns all of science. And now, I am the only truth-telling scientist in history. I will be right back. Keep looking up. Thank you.